There are many techniques for joining the corners of cabinets. I've shown you some. Here's another. This is a technique that requires more practice than others. Dovetails are associated with very fine craftsmanship. There are many ways that you can cut them. You can use a router. Some people cut them on the table saw, some people cut them on the bandsaw, and some people cut them by hand. I'm going to show you how I cut them by hand. So the wood I've selected for my dovetailed cabinet is maple. This piece will become the bottom. This piece, a little wider, will become the top, and these will be the sides. First, I'm going to use a marking gauge on every piece. I set the depth of the marking gauge so it's just very slightly thicker than the material used for the box top and sides. To use the marking gauge, I simply hold it tight against the end of the stock until I can feel the point resting, and I drag the point across, and it makes a very slight indentation in the wood. And I'll do that on both sides and at each end of each piece. So having done the top and bottom, I can move on to the sides. So now I'm ready to start laying out exactly where the pins will go on the top and bottom. So now, as I plan my dovetail design on the side, I'm going to take into consideration that the top is wider than the bottom. The top being a little wider allows the top to overhang the front edges of the doors. So I'm marking out the location of the pins. I'm going to put one pin right at the center, and I'm going to mark on each side of that 1/16 inch. I'm going to do the same thing over here on the side. I'm going to mark at 3/4 inch and mark at a 1/16 on each side. And the same thing here at the 3/4 inch from that other end and mark at each side. So now I know approximately where my 3 pins are going to go. I've set up this sliding T to a 1/2 to 4 inch or 1:8 ratio. 1:8 is the recommended ratio for hardwoods to determine the angle. So I'll mark this like that, and that. Now the same thing goes here. I'm marking these so I have 3 pins on each side. How you arrange them is completely up to you. So I have to draw a vertical line that I'll try to follow as best I can with the saw. But now I'm ready to start making my cut with the Japanese pull saw. I won't have to go through measuring again. I can use this same piece of wood to mark everything else. I cut down until I reach the marking gauge line on each side. And then I'll start the next cut. Okay. So now in order to translate those marks onto every other piece I'm going to cut, I want to lay it down in relation to my top, and I'm going to mark across here so I know where to lay out my parts on this. I'm going to mark this here, here, to where I can transfer my marks to this piece as well. Okay. So now I can put this other end in my clamps and use my sliding T bevel to mark out my positions. Okay. So you remember I mentioned that the top of the cabinet will overlay the doors. This is the way the side will fit. I'm checking now to make sure that when I cut my dovetail pins, I remember to leave the proper opening right here for the sides to fit. So what I've done is I've marked that, and I'll cut along this line as well as cutting along these lines to form the pins. So I'll make that exact same cut on the other side. Now that I've cut the shape of my pins, I'm going to remove some of the waste around them to make chiseling a lot easier. So I'm going to remove this little bit right here using the bandsaw. I'm going to make a cut in here with the bandsaw and a cut in here with the bandsaw. And you can see that that will take out a whole lot of the waste, making whatever I do next a lot easier. Same thing here, same thing here. I'll stay away from this marking gauge line because that line is essential to getting a clean final cut with a chisel. You can do this many ways. You can use a coping saw to cut by hand. You could use a scroll saw. You could just start chiseling it, even though it's going to be a lot more work. You may have noticed that I made all of my cuts face side down on the bandsaw, and the reason for that was I wanted to avoid cutting into my pins. I can cut right up to the line on this side, but if I cut up to the line on this side, it would cut into the back side of that pin. So now I can take a chisel and lay it in and start removing material. So this part goes relatively quickly. Sometimes I have to do a little more work. But you'll notice I'm staying away from my marking gauge line, which is essential for my last cuts. So at this point, I'm not really very concerned about anything except getting a lot of the waste out of the way. So if I cut back from that line, leave a little bit where the chisel will nest. This maple is really hard wood. So I'm staying back from my marking gauge lines. At the last cut, I'll be able to get right in there and make a paring cut as clean as I possibly can. Now I'm going to go in on that line. So I'm simply observing anything that would keep these dovetails from going all the way together when they're assembled. But when I get those to where they look nice and square, I can double check them using a square to see that when I did my cutting that I didn't wander too far off the line. Now that I have my pins completed, I'm going to use them to mark out my tails. So this is my right side. I'm going to flip it over this way. This is my front edge, and this is the bottom. So I want it to line up just like that. But first I'm going to take this piece of wood, line it up along the marking gauge line, put 2 clamps on so I have a real clear point of reference to mark my pin. So now if I can line these up and hold that in place, being careful that it not move one way or the other. And I'll take a marking knife. I'm going to hold it real tight. I'm going to mark right along that edge, and then I'll mark down the other sides. The knife is much more accurate for moving along an edge of something than a pencil. Okay. So now I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to mark down each face. And while the knife marks are not as dark as the pencil lines, they do provide a place where you can rest your chisel as you work. So I slid sideways. You have to be attentive as you do this to feel what's happening. You can always come back and darken them a little bit with a fine point if you want to just make them a little more visible. One thing I want to do is be very careful that I cut on the correct side of the line, and it's real easy to get confused, especially if you haven't been practicing a lot. So what I'll do is I'll take my pencil and I'll just give myself a little reminder that this is the space here that needs to come out in order to form my dovetail joint. And you can see on this I have 2 large tails and 3 pins on each joint. And so now I'm going to cut the tails. I'm laying it in right on my knife cut. One of the nice things about the knife line is that you can cut right down as close to it as you can, and if you're just a little bit off, you can come back with a chisel and pare to that line. You definitely don't want to cut outside the line, and so as long as you cut either right on the line or just a tiny bit within the line, you're going to be okay. So now they're sawn. I could just come back here with my chisel and mallet and start removing stock. Again, I want to stay away from that line and leave that last little bit for a cleanup cut later. One of the things you want to think about in designing the size of your pins is how narrow of a chisel can you fit in to cut the tails. So if you cut them narrower than you have a chisel to fit, then you're in trouble. I have a chance now to look at this and see how I'm doing. And it looks like everything's going to work out just as we would hope. I still have to trim to the marking gauge line, so that's going to be my next job. Okay, I have a little bit of paring to do, which I'll do with my straight chisel. In this case, when the dovetails are pushed completely together, it'll stick out just a little bit, which allows me to do some sanding and leveling so that they line up perfectly flat. Now, you may make other choices on your dovetails. For example, On this cabinet, the dovetails overhang at the sides, and the pins protrude at the top. It takes time to cut dovetails, but when you think about how long a piece of furniture can last, this can last over 100 years or more. So a little extra time is of no significance.